What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Coin and Geek. My name is Elliot. Today is Saturday, July 22nd. Doing our sporadic show whenever we can. Trying to do every 2 weeks, but sometimes it's every 3 weeks, depending on what either of us have going on. But I am joined, as always, by my friend and co-host, Mr. Daniel Schultz. What's up, Daniel? How are you?
I slept until 8 o'clock this morning. I don't know how it happened. It's a miracle with
Yeah.
two little ones in the house who were both awake. I do not know how, but yeah, both my wife and I slept until 8 o'clock. I couldn't remember the last time it happened, but
That's a good feeling. What time do you normally getting up to go to work?
oh well, I don't have to be to. I work like a swing shift, so I don't have to be to work till later. But usually we're getting up well before 8.
Yeah. For my new job, I've been getting up at 4:30, which is early. And like, I was never like, it's like that Simpsons episode where Principal Skinner has Bart for like a week or whatever, and he wakes him up, or he's like, "You're going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning," and Bart's like, "There's a 4 o'clock in the morning now." And that's basically how I've lived most of my life. So for the last month, it's a struggle. So I think I woke up around 7 or 7:20, and I was like, "Oh wow, that's the most rested I have felt in 6 weeks." So well, I'm glad to have you here, man. So I have to apologize if anybody's listening to this. I didn't get the show. Well, I got the show posted, but I didn't really promote it last week. But we did have a good conversation, I think, about everything happening with the FTC and the Microsoft acquisition of Blizzard and Activision. Sort of gave our overall opinions on that. So somebody asked about it on the Coin and Geek channel or on the Coin and Geek Facebook group, and I linked the podcast to that. So if you want to hear our kind of full out thoughts on that, you can. We'll touch on it a little bit here. But before we get into that, Daniel, what have you been doing lately in the realm of nerdy stuff? Been playing anything, watch any movies, read anything that has sparked your interest?
I've been playing FIFA. Yeah. FIFA 16.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say, I was thinking, like, are you playing that new FC 24 or whatever?
I might get it. I might. So a few years ago, I started following #United, which is a soccer team located just east of London in Essex, and they're founded by a YouTuber, a guy named Spencer Carmichael Brown. And at first they were just competing against other YouTubers and things, and then they became like an actual team. And I don't know if you know how soccer works in other countries, but basically you could start with an amateur team in like the lowest league of soccer and eventually be in the Premier League if you won every league or got promoted to the league above you continuously. So he made a team, got real players. His dad actually was a what would you call it, athletic trainer, a physiotherapist in non-league soccer in England, and so he had connections, and he got a manager, and he got players, and all of these things, and they've actually gotten up to just 2 levels now. They're now 2 levels below where Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney's team was last season. So they're actually pretty good. But that being said, I started following them, and I've been into soccer a little bit more than most sports because I stopped caring about sports a while ago. But soccer, I don't care enough that I get mad if somebody loses or super happy if somebody wins. So it's like the perfect sport for me right now.
So the emotional investment angle is
exactly
is a deterrent. I understand that. I get really worked up about. Well, I do get worked up about sports, but I don't watch sports very often for the similar reason. Like, it used to be so bad with me when like going to Apologia, which is an afternoon service, is like a kind of a blessing because I don't get to watch most of the football games. I have to be there early to set up for worship. And so in the past I would watch the game and I just get super frustrated. Now I just like I follow the highlights and I'm less like, oh well, we're down by 20 points. Like I don't
Right.
have to go through all the emotional ebbs and flows of the stupid game itself. But I am like excited about I can't break myself away from the Suns, especially right now. Are you did you since you follow sports, are you or soccer, do you have any care about like Messi coming over and being a part of the
I think it's cool.
yeah,
I think it's cool. I want to try to get it eventually, maybe not this season where the tickets are going to be crazy
yeah,
trying to get one, but maybe either go out to LA or Salt Lake or something. So we don't the Phoenix team
yeah.
isn't in the MLS, so
Mhm.
um, yeah, go watch one of those games and see them play. I think it'd be cool. One of
Yeah.
the greatest soccer players of all time. But
Yeah. Is he still like in his prime or like I mean, is it
probably
like a Beckham thing where
like
he's coming here for his
probably 2 years after. But he's still fantastic. Like last year, he was playing in the French league for the last 2 seasons, and he had around 20 goals and over 10 assists. So that's a pretty good normal person season.
yeah,
When he's historically been scoring like 30 top
yeah.
30s in the goals every year and having like 15 to 20 assists. It's probably not a great Messi season, but he's certainly good enough to play in the MLS.
I'm swinging back around to video games. I really enjoy soccer games for a little while, like in 2010, and I remember 2010 because that's when like the World Cup was in Africa,
Mhm.
and I got that World Cup game for the
Yeah, me
360,
too.
and I played the snot out of that.
Yeah.
I played it with my buddies too, and those were some of the most funny. My friends and I, including Jerry, who like we have some really funny just inside jokes that we'll quote to each other just because I'm not like a good FIFA player, but I was way better than them. And so they would come out and like I'd be like Scotland or something, and they were, Brazil or some team that was like way statted out. And my
Yeah.
guys would just be way slower, but I could still score like 15
Right.
goals on them.
That's
And
funny.
but we had a lot of fun with that. So oh, that's cool, man. I am interested in the FC 24, which I think is because they lost the FIFA license, right? Is that kind of like what
Yeah.
in
So
FIFA?
FIFA FIFA wanted more money than EA was willing to pay, and
Yeah,
EA said, "Well, good luck finding someone else to make your soccer game. There's kind of no competition right now." And so they've gone the FIFA-less route, which I think will be fine for them.
yeah,
It'll be a little weird, the transition, a game that we've called FIFA since 1994, I think.
yeah,
It'll be a little strange, but I think overall there's so many competitions and it's the big game that everybody plays, the ultimate team, all of that stuff is going to be the same. They have all the same competitions. There's still going to be, I believe that there's still a FIFA license within the game so that your team, you could hypothetically, I think, still participate in the World Cup within the game. I
oh, okay,
believe. So it
okay,
won't be that different. It's just it won't have the FIFA moniker. And I guess
yeah.
FIFA is going to be like, oh, we're making our own game. And in the words of Bender from Futurama, with hookers and blow. But anyways, yeah, no, it's
That's
EA
funny.
will be fine.
Yeah, yeah, they will. Oh, that's cool. I recently finished Final Fantasy 16. I'm gonna do a whole spoiler cast on that with my buddy John Marcus, who we've had on the show before, because he's also playing the game. I don't want to give too much away. I will say I really, really loved the game. But there are things about it's not a perfect game, and it's one of these games that like I've been thinking about this a lot, and I will probably bring it up a little bit in our topic in terms of like gaming culture, because I think this is maybe one of the things that sparked it is like not just the debate about it, but kind of the toxicity around games that people like or dislike. And going back to the sports analogy that you said about not, why you don't watch sports, like there's a certain freedom in that, right? Because you can kind of be a little bit more logical and objective in terms of your assessment of things. Whereas like a game as huge as Final Fantasy that's been around as long as Final Fantasy will garner really strong emotions one way or the other. And it's almost like Star Wars in some ways, where it's like everybody has in their own mind what Star Wars is. And Star Wars is a Western. No, Star Wars is a comedy. No, Star Wars is this. It should be more like Empire. No, it should be more like A New Hope. And or no, like the prequels were Star Wars. And so it's like there's that kind of thing going on with Final Fantasy. And this particular one made a lot of hard shifts into a direction that will upset some people. But I'll just say this, like I put about 60 hours in it. I did all the side quests. I did all the side quests, but there's another thing in the game called hunts, which are kind of like an additional side quest where they're exactly what they sound like. You go fight special characters and get, rewards for it. I have not finished all of those, so I will go back and finish that, but I did finish the main plot. I think it's phenomenal, dude. Like I think for somebody like me who really, the things I care about most in Final Fantasy, especially RPGs in general, but really Final Fantasy is like the emotion and the feeling that they garner. Like what I remember about Final Fantasy is the story and the characters and oftentimes the music, because there's some themes that, and on all of those notes, it is so good. It is definitely one of the best. It's top 3 for me as far as like Final Fantasies.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what would be the other 2 for you?
Well, 7's probably always going to be my favorite. And I'm going to reflect on 7 at some other point, because as playing through this game, there's some things that were like, wow, 7 did so many things. Like there's things that I wish that are missing in Final Fantasy 16 for me, that I was like, okay, well, this is what I liked about Final Fantasy 7. Like for instance, the chocobo breeding. It's kind of a stupid, mundane thing, but there was incentive to do it because you need to get the golden chocobo to fly to the island to get the final materia Knights of the Round, which then basically broke the game because you could just beat Sephiroth with like one casting of that. But there's like a side quest and there's purpose behind it, and there's like there's so much variation in that game. It's kind of insane that going from Midgar to everything else outside of it, you snowboard or you chocobo race, you have all these weird kind of tangential memories that are like outside of the main plot, where it's like when my Final Fantasy experience is related to all of these other things. Or if you're a Final Fantasy 6 fan, you remember the opera house, or you remember like wandering around the plains and trying to collect monsters. And there's things that's like, okay, the plot's good, but all these tangential things are like the aspects that kind of build this out. And Final Fantasy 16,
if you're a fan of 8, you remember emo teens playing a card game.
Yeah. And I mean, well, and to its credit, that spun off into a whole other thing. I don't think Final Fantasy, again, I want to save some of this. I don't think Final Fantasy 16 has that level of depth and RPG mechanics. And that's probably my biggest disappointment with it, is that it's very, I'd say streamlined. Some people would probably say dumbed down. And I think either term is appropriate, where it's more like a Devil May Cry. Like if you could merge like a Witcher type game, but with Devil May Cry mechanics, you kind of have that idea. But the voice acting is easily the best. If you would ever played Final Fantasy 14, like you would be shocked that like you go from 13's voice acting and Final Fantasy 7 remake, which I think Final Fantasy 7 remake is good voice acting, but it's still very like typical anime acting, I would call it. Whereas this game it was recorded in English first, and that was like a huge thing, is that they didn't record it in Japanese and then try to translate it into English. They recorded it all in English, so everything feels super natural. When you're hearing people talk, you're like, oh yeah, that's exactly how people talk. It's not like they don't use like weird inflection or the pacing that you can sometimes get in weird kind of translations. But the story is super mature. It's an M-rated game, but it's not just mature. It's let's see. Actually, I didn't have this kind of like revelation until I talked to my brother about it, but it reminds me of like a similar feeling in some ways as like Full Metal Alchemist, where it's like a story centered around like brothers, but there's a larger story going on. But it does such a good job of telling a lot. Like the broader story is there, and that is kind of the the impetus to keep things going. But within that broader story, there are multiple, like what would you call it? The plot keeps changing, in the sense of like, it starts off where your main character is trying to do one thing, but then something shifts and the plot gets thicker. But there's still these characters that are central to the game and central to making you feel something. And there's just times, man, where like I was getting emotional. I'm like, man, this game. And not just from like, oh, this is really sad, but like there's the boss battles in this, and the music and the spectacle. I don't know the best way I can compare that I think you would get, Daniel, is like, you remember in like Return of the King, when the riders of Rohirrim, they charge in, and like Theoden does his big speech, like ride now, ride, and
Ride for ruin.
yeah, and I think they're all charging in, and like the music's just blaring,
Yeah.
and they come in like that gets me every single time. Like my emotions are high, like tears coming down. You're like, like there are probably 5 or 6 moments like that in this game where you're just like, holy cow, like whatever they're doing, it's like such an assault on the senses in a good way, where you're just like, this is incredible. But there are problems with it, and I'm gonna save that for the spoiler cast. So, but I loved it, but there's still things where I'm like, okay, I could see why. I think they should have done these things, and it could have been like even that much better. But
So this one 7, and what's the third?
I have to put 6 in there. Well, I would say right now 6 is probably second, and then I would put 16 third. So it's 7, 6, and then
Poor 10 got kicked off the list, or what?
Okay. I don't want to say I don't like 10, because I like 10, but I think I don't understand I think maybe it appealed to a different generation than me, or I think 10 annoys me.
It's the people right after you. So like for me, I never played 7.
Yeah.
But I remember watching my friend's brother play 10.
Yeah.
I didn't have a PlayStation, but they were like, he was playing it, and it looked so cool. So I think, obviously, me being just a few years younger than you, that like it's probably more my time frame. Because I remember the first Final Fantasy game that I remember, I knew of it, and I had played the original Nintendo one on a Nintendo back in the day. But then the first one I remember being aware of was actually 8. And then I remember my friend Royce had 9, and he was like super into 9. And I never saw it, but I remember he had like he brought the game to school. Like we used to do weird things when we were a kid. Like there's no point other than like just having, I don't know. But he had the game, and I remember like looking at the cover and saying, this looks awesome.
Yeah.
And then the first one I actually played, or like saw played in a longer format, was 10. So for me, like I understand why.
I'm not going to poop on 10. I think 10's good. I actually, the last time I
best
played
voice
it,
acting by far.
ha ha ha. Well, and so that's actually a good example. There's almost a weird juxtaposition with that, where it's like, hey, Final Fantasy's doing voice acting for the first time, and it's like, it's not really that great voice acting. But I mean, it's okay, but it's just like, it's very stilted, and it's very like, you get like the weird inflections and things. And I think Final Fantasy 16 is like, okay, they've kind of been leaning into action stuff, but like this is their first full-on action game, and
20
it's like,
years later, they finally got voice acting right. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, okay, well, they got something core here that's cool, but I think the next few iterations of it will really play out even better. But yeah, I think the overall story of Final Fantasy X is interesting and cool. I guess I didn't really jive with the aesthetic as much as some. I don't.
Well, I don't like the futuristic. I don't like the
Yeah.
quasi-futuristic settings at all. So like for me, 9 is the best. I love 9. I played the first one, the fourth one, 6th. Played. I've never beat 7, but I've played it. 9, 10, and then 12. I guess is the next. Like, because 11 was the first MMO, right?
Right.
Which numbered MMOs are stupid, but yeah. So I like 9 the best.
I think 9's really good. I don't remember as much about the main plot as I do about the other ones, but this one does go back to the fantasy.
But I think that's why I like it.
Yeah, this does go back to the fantasy aesthetic, and it's high fantasy in the sense
Yeah.
of like it's way more Game of Thrones than it is like whatever Final Fantasy 9 is, where you got like chibi characters and kind of all the different things. But anyway, I recommend it for anybody. There's a demo that you can download that's like basically gives you the first, like the prologue of the game, which is fairly fleshed out. It's almost 2 hours, and you can get like a good sense of the style of game it is and the tone of it and the quality of it. And if you haven't downloaded it yet and you have even a passing interest, I would suggest doing that because you'll get a really good taste for it. But I'm going to shelve all the rest of my. Yeah, go
At
ahead.
some point, we should have a longer segment where we talk about what makes something a Final Fantasy game. Like what are the essential elements?
Well, I think that's I think that would be cool. I think we should bring on another guy to do that too, somebody who's played through more of them. But I do think that that's a good topic because that does kind of lead. Okay, so
you filthy Final Fantasy casual, you're not good.
I've played all of them pretty much, almost all of them. And actually, funny enough, before I say this again, Final Fantasy 14. So I will say this on the last part. 16 was developed by Creative Business Unit 3, which is a branch of Square Enix, the same team that developed Final Fantasy 14, and basically took that game that was completely dead and turned it around to, I think right now it's the most. I think it beat World of Warcraft in terms of subscribers. And if you've ever played 14 at all for any period of time, you're going to see exactly the influence on Final Fantasy 16, and I would say in all the right ways and in some of the wrong ways, where it's like, oh, I can see why some of the side quests feel like an MMO, like the janky, like, hey, let's just like little fetch quest stuff. That kind of stuff's like, hey, they could evolve this. But Yoshi P, the producer of the game and director of Final Fantasy 14, like his touch and style is all over this. And like, I think what I'm really excited about is that like, this is the dude that's going to continue to take Final Fantasy forward. And I'm really excited about that because I think his creative vision is really great. And I'm excited to see what they do next. But you know what? You asked a good question about what makes a Final Fantasy. So I'm going to transition this into the topic of the day, which is gaming culture. So what I just described is like, I would say, from at least my reading online and comments and things, in most of my experience, most people feel the same way I do about the game, which is that they really like it, that it was extremely memorable, emotional, all these things, but that there are some issues and some things they would fix. The RPG elements again are really bare bones, and if you're playing a JRPG, you want to have a certain amount of customization, that kind of thing. But the question comes back around to what makes a Final Fantasy a Final Fantasy. And I think that's a very valid conversation to have, especially with a franchise that's been around for 30 years, in the same way that's like, well, what makes Star Wars and these kinds of things. But okay, so I'm gonna sit on Final Fantasy 16 in particular just for a little bit, just so I could use this to kind of spread out into the greater topic of gaming culture. So Final Fantasy 16, this is one aspect of it. Final Fantasy 16 garnered some negative feedback right away. The first trailer it was shown, because it was an action game. So the first thing you get is like, this isn't turn-based. What are we doing? Okay. So then you're going to have the thing of like, okay, Final Fantasy isn't turn-based. You can make the argument that every Final Fantasy is different. They've done something different with that. This isn't Dragon Quest. That's not something that they've tried to maintain a similar feel the whole time. That they're very like experimental with one of their biggest franchises. Well, with their biggest franchise, and some, I think it's one of those things where you're going to like some things and you're not. But the push, there's that aspect of it, and then the next kind of big controversy that came out was, I'm saying controversy in quotations, in that like I would call them the vocal minority, but it came up in a lot of interviews. Why are there no black characters in this game? why is there lack of representation? And I know it's immediately grown. And Yoshi P gave like a really solid answer. You can go read it online. It's pretty well thought out. But the basic essence of it is like, we're basing this game on like European, like that's our influence. Like this is a game that is based upon like classic medieval European look and feel, which, think of King Arthur, that kind of thing. King Arthur didn't have, black people running around in society, like, or at least none that were mentioned by name. So it's like, you're in this very Anglo-centric kind of part of the world. And that's what the aesthetic was based off of. Now there is variations of this within the game. There's guys that are maybe a little more Middle Easternish, just because of the location. They're in a desert kind of climate, and so there's a bit. But there really are no black people in the game. But I don't think so. That started up another wave of controversy among a certain amount of people, and then the game comes out, and then you have some of the complaints about the game, which is that, well, this game doesn't have any RPG elements. This isn't Final Fantasy. No, I mean, it has very little, very few. You have like your upgrading in your equipment, and you can.
But there's no distinct levels.
Oh no, you do level. You level, okay. But yeah, the game itself is like very.
It's not Metroid, but it's not.
No.
Traditional JRPG.
Yeah, it's hard to say without going into the whole thing, but basically, like, okay, so Final Fantasy VII is, well, let me back up. There are no status elements at all. There's no, like, you're poisoned. There's no you're stoned. So you'll fight like I think it's called a Marble. It's that thing with like the big tentacles, and it casts a spell called Bad Breath. And Bad Breath is always historically like the worst thing about fighting this enemy is that it hits you with all these status effects, and you have to like constantly like, I need to use a potion, or I need to use an elixir, and I have to. There's none of that going on. This game is highly focused on just the combat, and so all of your tools as well are based around mostly causing damage, not necessarily causing like specific elemental damage, where it's like, hey, if I'm fighting a fireball, if I use my ice element, it's going to do extra damage because it's fire versus ice, that kind of thing. That kind of thing is basically stripped bare. Like there's no real strategy in that sense. and there's no real strategy in terms of what kind of equipment that you basically just keep getting better equipment. And it's like, well, I got a stronger sword. But the whole like challenge of the game conceptually is that it's skill based, and so just like a Devil May Cry would be, Devil May Cry isn't really about upgrading your weapons, even though you do get upgrades. It's about like fighting enemies that have different tactics, and you being better at dodging, and you knowing how to like take down these enemies in a certain way. So it's similar to that. Anyway, that I think threw a certain segment of people off. And that's fine as well. But what's going on now is that you have this, like, you get into this area where I want to talk about this too. Like, you go on Metacritic and you just see what we know as like review bombing. People going on there and giving them zeros, or people like starting forums and being like, we need to boycott this game because it doesn't have representation. And it's just, and even in my like looking at the YouTube algorithm, and you and I both done, I mean, we're not professionals, but we've done this long enough to where we can kind of pick up on trends and what we see and how the algorithm works when you're searching for something you like. But a lot of people, I think, in the gaming community are just latching on to these like negative things and using it to, it's hard to know, like, do you really believe this stuff? Are you just doing this to prop up like your channel because he's like, oh, Final Fantasy 16 is awful, and so you can get more clicks and you can rant on it? And then there's like this subsection of people that are causing division, and it's like, I haven't really engaged in any of that, because the truth is, like, I freaking like the game, and I don't want to, like, I don't mind having a conversation about the problems with the game with somebody like you or somebody else who's played it and is like, hey, here's what I feel about it. But I think this is kind of this thing where we're in this culture where it's like, it seems so easy to switch on a dime to something really, really negative. And I feel like I don't know if it's a product of younger generation. I don't know if it has to do with us, but I do feel like we're kind of poisoning the well in a sense, and sort of ruining the parts of gaming that I like, that are just like, not just the game itself, but talking about the game, not just like, being like, hey, what did you think about this? Or like, let's talk about, what do we like about this? What do we not like about this? The kind of conversations we're trying to have on here. What are your overall feelings about, it doesn't have to be about Final Fantasy 16, but just kind of where you think gaming culture is in regards to just having good discourse about video games, and then kind of the overall vibe that you feel is going out there.
Yeah, I think overall it's unfortunate just how the community
Yeah, I know,
What I
right? Everybody's got a
perceive,
community now.
the community that I perceive as being
Yeah.
the video game culture, video game community, is one that is not. It's not as much as people say, "Oh, look how many people play video games," and uh, it's the biggest medium in the world, and all this stuff in terms of making money, and it is not at the point in society where something like a book is or a movie. And I don't mean that in a like it's not artistic enough or anything like that, but
Right.
rather that when a a 60-year-old dips in to watch a a Marvel movie when they were coming out and people were actually watching them, uh, they they're like, oh, Captain America, yeah, I'll go see that, and they see the movie, or they're like, oh, it's on Freevee, I'll watch it, and so they
Mhm.
watch some movie. But really, the people who I think are playing video games are people who have continuously played video games. There are people that have gravitated towards certain games and they just play the one game they've played for the last 10 years. Uh, my older brother, is a person like this, where he plays very few new games. Like he has played Heart of the Swarm, Heart of the Storm from Blizzard, and that has been like his primary game for the last few years, and he has not played hardly anything else. And
Mhm.
I think those kind of people are rare. I think for most people, it's like whatever's the newest game, and they're all playing the same things, and it makes this insular community where everybody has to like and play everything. And when we started this podcast a few years ago, I did the catchphrase, which I still say, which is play the games the way you want to play them. And the idea of that was, at the time, it seemed like gaming was going to change. I think that there was going to be more more casual participation, and I don't mean the casual in the sense that the video game culture would call it
Yeah,
casual,
right.
but in sense that there would be that one could believe that there might be somebody who just likes to play RPGs, or
Mhm.
they just like to play this one game. They started on the phone. They're like, "Oh, this looks fun." They started playing something, and they're like, "Oh, well, let me find out more about this." And then they start getting into a game. And I don't think that's happened. So my perception of video game culture is that, especially our generation, has had video games our entire life. We from childhood to now, there's been no break in our participation with the medium. And then with the rise of the internet, and like you're saying, with the negative content being king in terms of goosing the algorithm, uh, getting people to click. I mean, that's just a fact. Everybody knows that you're much more likely to get clicks if you hate legitimately bad movies like The Last Jedi and whatever Skywalker, or what, I don't remember what it's called. It's so terrible. But the if you hate on those, you're gonna get a ton more views, and you're like, oh, I thought it was a solid, like me, my opinion. I thought Last Jedi was like a solid C. Like I didn't hate it, didn't think it was the worst movie ever. That wouldn't have got any clicks, right? And neither does
Sure.
effusive praise. So it does create. There's always things tangentially related to these popular mediums. Like growing up, my dad watched Star Trek when it was first coming out on TV and then in reruns, and he really liked Star Trek. So that when the movies came out, he had seen some of the movies when they were coming out in the 80s, and then when we came along, we started watching The Next Generation as a family. Then we watched Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and then Enterprise happened, and nobody watched that. But the point is, like, we watched these shows, but never did we go to a convention or participate in some sort of related media.
Mhm.
But with video games, there's kind of a presumption that you're not just going to play the game, but you're also going to consume things like our podcast. You're
Yeah.
going to be into it a more than just a casual dipping in. Like if a casual if Filthy Casual plays Fortnite, or they're going to have a rude awakening. But let's Rocket League might be a better game because there's more team games in Rocket League that you might play, or Overwatch or something. Like it's a huge steep learning curve to get into those, because if you don't go in knowing how to play or having some idea of how to play, there's going to be this toxic response. There's going to be someone making fun of you, yelling at you,
Sure.
sending you curse words in the chat, or something to tell you how terrible you are at a game that you're playing for the first time. If you go to see a movie at the movie theater, it is a singular experience. You might go with friends, or you might go by yourself, but like you're experiencing it in the same. It's a participation as there's a group in the room, but you're not a team. You're not. It's not competitive.
Right.
And gaming is a medium in the sense that we're controlling a program in a computer that is being labeled a game. But the difference between Myst and Tetris and Fortnite and Persona, these are vastly different experiences. And my hope a few years ago was that the medium would evolve to the point where people were entering at different points and not having to join that broader culture. But I
Yeah.
don't think that's happened. And I think part of that is all the things that I criticize all the time, like microtransactions and crappy mobile games and all these things that, like, when mobile games were first happening, and you'd think like, oh, well, somebody's going to come out with a game that you just buy, and it's not mobile game, microtransaction heavy, and they'll transition people into playing other games, but it never happened. Obviously, the money was in stealing people's money when they run out of lives on Candy Crush, not in making a good game that plays on the phone.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on some good stuff there. As you're talking, I was thinking through some other aspects of. I'm kind of going off the cuff here. I don't have notes written down, but I was thinking about just where the state of gaming culture is, in the sense of like where has it been, where is it now, where is it going. And it is interesting, right? Because so much of this medium is tied to advances in technology,
mm-hmm.
in the social media and in the internet age, right? Books have been around obviously hundreds of years, and you could have a discussion about a book, theoretically, hundreds of years ago. You just, whether you're writing letters or you're getting a group together, it's a slower, more intimate setting. So you typically probably wouldn't have the same. My dog's going crazy. I don't know what's going on over there. Can you hear that?
Yeah, just barely.
Oh man, I'm sorry about that.
But I have the sound.
So yeah, probably a bug. Hold on a second. All right, I guess I'm gonna have to deal with it. She normally doesn't look like that, but no. So getting back to this thing, is like there's an establishment there. You could say movies. Movies precede social media as well, and so you had like your Siskel and Ebert and like your guys that you would, if you want to say like higher level criticism, right? Whether you agree with their stance on it or not, but people would. What's that?
No, go ahead. Move on.
Yeah,
well, they were
mean,
top level, but
yeah. But I mean, like, you at least have two guys break. I mean, this stuff was on like regular TV.
And to be granted, like their movie reviews are not the same thing as their television show, like in their newspaper. No. Like when they actually go in depth, like you read an Ebert review, and sometimes he'd be like, "This movie sucks, and it's awful. You shouldn't go see it." But then other times he would talk about he was an actual writer, and it's tough. It's tough in a time when everybody can make content that can go out to hypothetically to the world right now, um, we
Yeah,
could be
you're hitting
it.
on something I think it's important, and it's like, well, okay, so we're still figuring out like who is the authority here, and I say that in like, you know, like small letters. Like, I will listen. One reason I like, well, there's lots of reasons I like listening to guys like Colin, but I like listening to Colin because whether I agree with him or not, he's been in the industry almost his entire adult life, and he has an appreciation and a respect and an understanding for the history of games because he grew up with them. Like, you played Nintendo games like as when they were popular. You know, it's
Yeah.
not like a lot of these guys that have these channels now, and a lot of these people that are driving the industry forward in terms of the discussion around games don't they only know about Nintendo from, you know, some YouTube thing, or maybe they picked up a classic console when they were, you know, older. So they don't have the same kind of context. And going back to the Siskel and Ebert thing, it's like, okay, well, film critics have 80 years, 90 years worth of film to go back and be like, well, now we can analyze where film was at as a medium, you know, in its incarnation all the way up through the 20s, 30s, and so on and so forth. And gaming right now, I think this kind of ties in with this whole, like, everything needs to be present, everything needs to be completely relevant all the time to whatever's going on, and that ties into this sort of psychological bent that we have as human beings to always have to be up on everything that's current, have to know the latest controversy, have to be, you know, outrage culture, that kind of stuff. All this ties together, you know, in terms of how we interact and just talk about things in general,
Right.
and that's bled over into our hobbies. And it sucks because it's like, I do want this hobby to be elevated. I want it to be, it's not to say that you can't have a goofy show, or you can't have, like, not everything has to be like serious discourse. I don't
Well, there's
always
a
want or
difference between
appreciate that, but
wanting it, like we're not saying we want it to be highbrow. Like, we're not
right,
saying like we want people to walk around like chest puffed out, like looking down on the masses that don't play video games. And what we're
right,
talking about is we want it elevated in the sense of we want it to be. It's just, I hate these buzzwords, but like normalized.
yeah,
Like, and although it has become way bigger a thing and more people are playing video games than ever before, it's not. It is not a normal it is not normal in the sense that talking about a book you've read is normal. And it's not that people are like, "Oh, video game." It's that it's it's unapproachable for the people that are not within it. Like,
mm,
to it's a way easier ask to get somebody to watch an anime that you really like. You know, hey, I know you like, Japanese animation, isn't it? This like girls with giant boobs fighting mechas, like, like that's not really something I'm into.
yeah,
But you're like, no, let me tell you, there's this thing called Full Metal Alchemist, or pick whatever your pet thing you like to tell people to watch is.
yeah,
So just watch this, like you'll get an idea of like this as a medium. Well, it's harder to do that with video games. If I wanted somebody to play a game that I think would knock their socks off in terms of a story, I'm gonna go to Mass Effect. So it's like,
hmm,
okay, well, how can this person play Mass Effect? Okay, oh good, it plays on the backwards compatibility of the Xbox One or the Xbox Series X. Do they have one of those? No. Okay, I'm asking them to make a giant investment in something that they may not like, versus saying, "Hey, rent this movie on Amazon or whatever rental service they're using," or like check out this. Go on Crunchyroll, which has an ad supported version, and watch this anime. It's like that's a way less of an investment to ask someone to make. Like, and we can't we we played Final Fantasy, the early Final Fantasy games.
hmm,
It's hard to play those today if you don't have a Super Nintendo or a Nintendo. You can't play them the way they were originally played.
right,
They're releasing collections today, but those are the remakes that were on like the PlayStation or on the Nintendo DS or something. Like, they are not the originals that we played. They're changed. If you want someone to experience these things, it's a it's a huge ask. It's a way bigger ask than saying, "Hey, I've got a book. Would you like to read it?" It's
yeah,
like, "Oh, I've got this game I love, but you'll have to spend $500." Or it's like, "Oh, it's only on PlayStation, so you're out of luck," or "It's only on Xbox."
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right, especially when it comes to RPGs. I mean, you could pick up and play. Well, this gets into another topic someday, but about games and their length and how that affects it. But I think yeah, it's almost, man, there's so much here, but I think about, okay, I'll take an instance of something that I'm not like a huge fan of. I'm not a hater or anything, but I'll take Halo. So when Halo came out, I didn't have an Xbox. And I played it and I was like, this is fine, but I wasn't like, and I still am not like a Halo fanboy. I don't have memories attached to Halo that the guys who were like, you know, maybe 5, 6 years younger than me and had like LAN parties
Like myself.
and yeah, that we're like, okay, my experience with this is my buddies coming over, bringing their Xbox, bringing their TV, and us setting up,
Yeah, right.
16 player, four split screen. Like my memory goes back to like GoldenEye for that. That was like my experience with that. But there's a whole attachment to Master Chief, and there's a whole like thing about the lore of him, and like I don't even know. I have no idea what the story of
It's
Halo is.
good. It's pretty good, man.
Like zero. All I know is like, okay, but you say that, but like none of that struck me when I was playing. I'm like,
Right.
this isn't my thing. But and that's okay. But I didn't start like a forum or a channel or
Right.
like, because our interaction about the games were like what we'd see when we were in person. So I'll rewind it a little bit. When Final Fantasy VII became popular, that was like a weird moment for me because I grew up playing the original Final Fantasy, and like Final Fantasy at that time was like kind of talked about in the same sentence as like Dungeons and Dragons or Magic the Gathering. It was like the nerd stuff. So when
Yep.
Final Fantasy became like popular and like my other like jock buddies were playing Final Fantasy 7, it was so like I was like, whoa, like this thing that I've loved is now something that everybody loves. But our conversation was revolved around like, I'm going to see this guy at wrestling practice. I'm going to ask him, hey, did you beat Sephiroth, or did you fight Ultimate Weapon? And then it was like, yeah, I did. That was so cool. Or we would talk about it in that sense. We weren't going around and generating little like parties of people that just agreed with or like hated on everything we hated about. And then it's like a different thing. We could come to
Yeah.
it more, in my opinion, more like authentically.
Well, it's like the '90s were so different. It seems like a different world to think back to the '90s and how we experienced culture.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was just somebody randomly saying, "Oh, have you heard about this? Have you heard of this thing?"
Yeah.
Whereas today, like I knew there was a new Final Fantasy game coming out. I knew that there was the stupid uh, representation
Mm-hmm.
controversy. I knew that that was an action game, more of an
Mm-hmm.
action game. Rather, I knew all of these things. I never looked it up once. I never went on YouTube and sought out a trailer or read an article about it. But it was just from how we experience the world and social media. Everything is so different
Yeah.
than in the '90s, where someone was like, "Hey, have you played Pokemon?" And you're
Right.
like, and then you get it, and you're hearing all these rumors about like, oh well, if you do this, like you talk to the guy that teaches you how to catch a Pokemon, and then you fly to Cinnabar Island and swim up and down the side of it. Like the fifth thing in your inventory will be duplicated, but if you catch the Pokemon, it'll screw up your game. So be careful. Like, or somebody you trick like, oh just catch it, no big deal. It's a secret Pokemon missing though, and like somebody would figure it out, or somebody would tell you on the playground, or something. Somebody would tell you these things. Like it was a different way to experience video games and to participate in it. And today, everything is ever present,
Yeah.
and because of the way that media has gone, there is if you want a big huge game like Final Fantasy, you have to go to these giant companies. As much as I love indie games, and that's other than FIFA 16. I play a lot of at least mid-level publisher games
Mm-hmm.
or indie games, and I like them. I enjoy them, but you are not going to be able to create an alternative at this point, an alternative community that is like in comic books. There's the comics gate kind of community where people that were fed up with the wokeness in DC and Marvel comics and the route that they were going and the bastardization of characters and all these horrible retcons that were just totally disrupting an entire history of a universe that had been consistent or at least fairly consistent. Like they were able to create their own comic books and go and make their own thing, and they're able to because comic books are cheap to produce relatively.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and then you have the same with novels. Like Will White right here, this book Unsold is a
Mm-hmm.
fantastic series, completely self-published. I highly recommend it. It's great, but you don't have that in video games as much as it might be some indie guy out there making some game. He's not able to make Final Fantasy 16. He's not
Right.
able to make some huge shooter. Like you're making it's a person making Stardew Valley, and it's a great game. It's a great
Yeah.
game, but it's not the same. And
Yeah.
I think the high barrier of entry for video games, you have to have a lot of knowledge in order to make one. Programming knowledge. You have to have a lot of money to make a big one. Like those things make for a community that's harder to participate in than something like a book or a comic book or a movie.
Yeah, you're right. And so people participate in their 10-second YouTube shorts commenting on it. This gets into another thing, and I entitlement. The like gamer entitlement is something that's been thrown around, and I want to say that I think I felt that more now playing Final Fantasy 16, because it's something that I care about, and I have to take a step back and look like how I've acted, because it is honestly, if I'm being honest, it's fun to like rip on something like Redfall or Star. Like I don't know how the new I always want to say it's not Stardew. It's what's the new one that's coming out from Bethesda, Star or something. Starfield, yeah. And it's like, okay, well, look at this game and look at it's only 30 frames per second and it looks like Fallout 4 graphics. But there is an aspect of this where it's like, are gamers in general, and I ask this about myself, are we missing the forest for the trees? And in the sense of like, hey, like, let's appreciate what we have, because there is an aspect, and I know you were going to say something, but I think there's an aspect of this, right, where it's like, I think there's a couple things at play here. I think one thing is that generationally speaking, on a technological level, we are not seeing the kind of leaps that we did from PS1 to PS2, PS2 to PS3. We're basically just iterating on it. Now games are getting a little bit better looking, like they're talking about coming out with a PS5 Pro, which is probably just going to be all it's probably going to do is just run like 4K graphics a little smoother and maybe ray tracing. But we're not talking about fundamentally changing the way we play games like we did when we made the transition from 2D to 3D. And I would even argue from 3D, like non-HD to HD, to some extent. So the expectation, I think, for some people is kind of baked in that, hey, whatever the next Bethesda game is going to be, it's got to be like the craziest thing ever. And it comes out and it's like, oh, this is basically what you get from Bethesda, just a little bit better looking and a little bit bigger. And people are let down by that. Or in Final Fantasy's case, it's like Final Fantasy 16 did so many things like at a super high watermark that the things that they didn't do so well feel way worse, even though they're fine. Like they're actually not that bad. But in comparison to where you're like, this stuff was like at an 11. So when things are at a 7, it feels like they're at a 2. And so you kind of walk out of there and it's like, and I really love this game. Like I had a great experience with it, but I'm still like, oh, but here. And is there that sense of entitlement that you think is kind of getting baked into how gamers, even before the game comes out, are coloring their view of how they experience games?
Yeah. Well, I wonder if some of that comes from the GameStop, we'll call it the GameStop mentality. That really, when we were high school, young adult age, it was a constant trading in, getting credit, getting a new game, trading in, getting credit. And again, all my friends are doing this. I never did that. I've kept pretty much all of my games. In fact, the games that I've traded in that I didn't even like, I feel bad about. Like, I'm like, that might have been a fun game to play. Like, I'm a retro gamer. I was a collector at some point when that was a hobby that wasn't scalped out of into oblivion. But
Yeah.
the point is, like, you have this mentality of everybody was always playing the new game. Like, I knew people who were living on welfare,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, government subsidies, who would scrounge enough money together to trade in the whatever the previous game that everyone was playing was to get the new game. Like, and they didn't even have a job, but they were continuously playing the brand new video game. And I thought, like, at the time, I just never understood. 'Cause every once in a while, like, new game would come out and I would pay $60 for it. Marvel Ultimate Alliance, the first one, tremendous, loved it. Things, Red Dead Redemption,
Mm-hmm.
games that were coming out that I had been looking forward to for a super long time. In terms of back then, a super long time was like 2 years when you just read about it in Game Informer and you're like, oh man, when's it coming out? But there was this constant push for the new, and unless you're someone who's super nostalgic for those times like me, and you want to go back and play TMNT Tournament Fighters for the first time again, and you're just like, oh, I remember playing that at so and so's house, and
Mm-hmm.
Tyler Blake's house. It was so fun, and blah blah. Like, unless you're chasing those memories, like, you're not going back and experiencing things. Whereas someone who gets into to to movies can go back and watch Hitchcock at any
Yeah.
time, and they're learning about the
Hey, buddy.
they're learning about film history. They can go watch Hitchcock. They can go watch John Ford, and they can experience these movies that, well, there might be some things that might be dated in terms of political correctness or like humor. For the most part, these films are going to hold up and they're going to be great because they're the greatest things ever made. But my older brother was talking about this the other day. He said, like, games were simpler back then, and like, you're not
Mm-hmm.
just going to sit down and play some of these games that we would have played for hours and hours and hours. You're not
Right.
going to play them for hours and hours and hours because they're so much simpler.
Yep.
They're so different that, like, the sense of history in video games is left to this smaller community, whereas somebody who gets really involved in filmmaking, they
Yeah.
want to know, what did the greats do? What,
Yeah.
what did Scorsese do? What did Coppola do? What did Lucas do? Like, how did they change? So you see a lot of positivity in those communities in movies. Like, somebody who gets deeper into movies, things like Nerdstalgic or Entertain the Elk or all these other Nerd Writer, all these people who are doing video essays about what was great about art in the past.
Yeah.
And in video games, there was some of that a few years ago, and there still are some channels. For the most part, it's what's new, what can we criticize, and I think it's such a different. Video games are so different from other forms of, because they're a
They're
competition
expensive.
potentially. They're
Yeah.
an art form potentially. They are an entertainment medium. They they're all of these things, and they're unique. It's like somebody playing backgammon or chess or getting really into to uh Go, the
Yeah.
Japanese fans. Like, there are that is not there's no story aspect to those games. But you play Ori and the Blind Forest, and there's a story aspect that you care about this little character, you're getting involved in the emotion of trying to get through and accomplish something and get
Yeah.
better at a game and learn the mechanics and progress in a game. And it's so different that I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think in terms of the entitlement, the medium, how it's developed, how everything surrounding it, from the stores that were selling the games, pre-orders, all of these things, it pushed and the constant technological innovation pushed people away from developing a more robust, healthier sense of an art form to constantly pushing towards the new.
Yeah. Well, and interesting is that in pushing towards the new, I think that what consumers are, again, sticking on Final Fantasy because it's what's on the top of my mind. But there is this, in pushing towards the new, they're still chasing something in the past. And what I mean by that is there's an aspect of this, and this is all just kind of as I've been ruminating on Final Fantasy 16 and thinking about the franchise in general. I'm like, man, I really love that game. I'm thinking about it a lot. It's sticking with me. And when you ask me what my favorite Final Fantasy is, it's probably never going to change from Final Fantasy 7 because I will never be able to replicate what I experienced playing Final Fantasy 7. Not just the game, but everything that we've just talked about. All of the hype leading up to it, all of like the good feelings I had from like talking about it with my friends and like uh, something that I love coming into the public. It's maybe akin to the guys that saw Star Wars in 1977, where it's like no matter how good Star Wars or how bad Star Wars ever gets, like nothing can ever replicate that experience because it was just something so seminal to them. But these franchises, these mega franchises like this they're still like they're aware of that. I would say that Final Fantasy, the guys behind that are aware of that. And so there's this like desire for us as fans to be like, well, I want to see something new and cool and big with a new story, but I
But
want it
you're
to be.
always judging it against the high of being 12.
Yeah, exactly.
The high of.
Yeah, it's layered with that, right? And I think it's the same way with Halo fans. And I haven't played a real Halo. I played a little bit of the newest one, and people that play Halo are like super critical of it. But I still think when I hear people talk about Halo, they talk about like Halo 2 and the multiplayer experience of that, or Halo 3. And it's like these games came out like 20 years ago, and so I'm sure these Halo games are fine and functional, but they're competing against like trying to stay relevant and trying to recapture something.
It's one of the problems with media in general is it's the same thing we're experiencing with the Lucasfilm properties right now.
Yeah, I agree.
Like I don't know a single person in real life that has gone to see the new Indiana Jones movie.
Me neither. No, I
Like,
know one person.
and why would we? We don't want it. Like the
Yeah.
type of people that we know are not going to go watch something from Disney, but unless they have to. But the point is, you have to have good caretakers of these franchises, and really, in video games, you did have franchises that came out, and they were defined by good caretakers. You had Nintendo, and Nintendo was making good Mario games. They were putting a ton of resources and time, and they had some of the greatest people of all time in terms of innovating and thinking about video games for the first time. Like going from Atari to Nintendo is such a huge jump. Like the Nintendo Entertainment System was such a huge jump from Atari that and you had people who were making things for the very first time or taking elements of what was there before and making something perfect that the mechanics of today are still in.
Dude, Mario 3 is still one of the best games ever made. Like today, you can pick it up and play it.
I mean, they're like Nintendo is an anomaly.
Yeah.
And it has but you had Sega, they were putting out decent games. You have all these caretakers of franchises that are making great games, and then they're trying to caretake those over time. And we see that they drop away. Like here's Nintendo and Sega, and then here's Sonic. Like just the quality of it going down and down and down.
Yeah.
Like Konami, you have Castlevania, and then there's some missteps. Castlevania 3, I think, is the one that's not really thought of as well. But you have ones that are thought of good, like Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night. And you have caretaking of a franchise. And now the people who innovated, the Nobuo Uematsus of the world, the people who innovated these franchises, they're long gone. and it's a corporate environment trying to balance nostalgia and innovation. And it's a tough ask. It's a tough ask. And
Yeah.
it's the same thing where it's like, obviously Star Wars could have been handled way better,
Yeah.
way better. But we're also not asking Star Wars to incorporate every new cinematic technique that's been done in the last 40 years since it came out.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing about video games is, let's say tomorrow, what's a game that doesn't really have a new entry? Here we go. One of my favorite franchises, the Chrono Cross and Chrono
Yeah.
Trigger games. Like, a new Chrono game comes out. It is going to have to incorporate 20 plus years of innovation in video games and still be definitively a Chrono game. And what makes a Chrono game? Those two games are pretty dissimilar.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, the main male character has red hair. Like, that's about the only thing they have in common other than their
Yeah.
RPGs. So like, there's so many factors in why I think to us as we age, that games feel different. And it's not just that they're made differently. It's the whole culture surrounding them. It's people's perception of them. It's the way that the companies make them. It's the size of them. All of these things really matter. Like, if Final Fantasy 17 came out
Mm-hmm.
and it was a throwback, like, um, you know, pixel art looking video game, and
Yeah.
it was huge. It's the biggest 2D RPG ever made. Like, and you have this fantastic story, and it's got a ton of great art in it, and it just looks amazing to us from nostalgia, that with our nostalgic glasses. It's not going to sell as
Yeah.
big as it would if it was 3D.
Yeah.
And yet, somebody who makes a film that is not asked to be like, oh well, forget what John Ford did, forget what Alfred Hitchcock did, forget what Scorsese did on Taxi Driver way back in the day, forget all those things. It take just like the barest, like, minimum of those things, like the names or the superficial level things, and make something totally different.
Yeah.
And I think that's what video games are, is us, like, chasing that nostalgia, but expecting that they be at the cusp of technology.
Yeah. I mean, you're hitting on something that plays into all of this, which is the business angle and the corporate angle of this, which, really poisons everything. And it's hard because we talked about it when we talked about nerd culture and movies and comic books, is that, there's people that care about the art form. There's people that care about that. And then, these companies that care about making money. And so they're going to invest in the things that are going to make them the most money. And Sony is doing that. And that's going to play into this whole narrative as well. And like, getting in, this is maybe tangentially related to this, but what we saw at the last Sony State of Play that they put out, Sony Experience, as they called it, was a bunch of new, free to play games, a bunch of new like stuff, because they're trying to recoup money, because for however big God of War is, and like you could say God of War is their biggest franchise, first party franchise, maybe the Last of Us somewhere. I don't know what the sales are, but it's huge. That does not, like, Fortnite makes what that sold in like a month. Yeah. It's not even close. Now, not everything can be Fortnite, but they
even
just
think about something like World of Warcraft,
right.
A 20-year-old game in and of itself, obviously there's expansions and everything, is still making way more money than
and
like
yeah,
a
and the
new
money
release
comes in.
Activision puts out.
The money comes in perpetuity, because it's just like, well, every month, we're releasing a new patch and all that jazz. And so I don't know, man. Like, I think what's probably going to be good for me, and what I think I'm doing, and I'm trying to do, is my world getting narrower when it comes to letting in any kind of voices when it comes to the medium that I love. So like, I do this show with you predominantly, and this, I've said this on record, like, nobody watches this show for me. I mean, whatever. I didn't put any money into this. I want people to see it, to join in the conversation, but I really care more about the conversation. Like I want somebody to talk to about these things, and somebody that's like, that's kind of a sad thing. Like we have all these mediums, and it's just like, I just want my buddy to talk to you about things
Yeah.
that I can have a conversation with about stuff as a 41-year-old gamer now, and not feel like I just have to be, Mr. like hype guy, and like, hey, let me throw, and like, I got to always, talk like this, and I got to, my channel has to be super hyped all the time. And to be able to even have a conversation, like, I don't want to engage in that. And maybe I'm just old and like, get off my lawn now,
Well,
but
I think
I miss this I miss this type of thing.
that's the natural course of hobbies. Like
Yeah.
when you go back, really, we're talking about something that is the luxury of being born in the 20th century, the late 20th century. Like we're
Sure.
talking about things that the person in 1500 had, they're not standing around with their friends saying like, "Oh, did you read the new book by so and so?" Until the printing press, and then you have Martin Luther, and they're like, "Dude, did you know that we don't have to pay to go to get out of purgatory? Like, have you
Yeah.
heard this? Like, yeah, they're stealing money from us, like to pay for some gaudy looking gold thing in Rome. It's like, I don't even live in
Yeah.
Rome. I've heard of it. That's where the Pope is, right? Yeah, yeah. Man, I'd like to go. Oh, and I know so and so went on a trip there one time with his dad for this. It's like that's what they're talking about, right? And like
Yeah.
the idea of a hobby, like none of them were sitting around like saying like, "Oh yeah, I like to make wooden soldiers and paint them and do war games," right?
Yeah.
We're really talking about the luxury of being the wealthiest, most prosperous society in the history of the world. Like we're
Yeah.
living like kings right now, you and I.
Yeah.
Like the luxuries that we have, the fact that we are not, in relatively speaking, in our modern times, you and I don't live that far apart, but that
Yeah.
we haven't seen each other in a few years now
Yeah.
in physical space, but we
Yeah.
talk to each other all the time. Like it's insane. Like we live, not saying like first world problems. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is like going back to the 20th century, and you have guys that like they're talking about their hobbies, whether it be fishing, bowling, whatever it was at the time.
Yeah.
Somebody in nerd, like the science fiction fandom, talking about books, or like, oh, I managed to find this book that was out of print, and they're talking about it. Like those aspects, like, there was a more mature adult, and since we're men, like
Yeah.
male conversation that was going on that was more than just this is crap,
Right.
or like I want to experience the same thing I did as a kid. Like there was a more mature conversation, and I think the saddest thing for me about games is that a few years ago the conversation was more robust. There was people who were excited about retro games. There was people who were excited about like, well, what are these games from Japan? And now everything is so accessible. You can know about everything, that like the discovery aspect of it, that's kind of faded away. The nostalgia aspect, that's kind of faded away. And I think what we're left with is making like you and I and whoever listens to this, making our own decisions about how we want to participate in gaming.
Yeah.
Like my lovely wife asked me the other day, she said, when you married me, did you think that I would become she might have said gamer, I don't remember what she said, but basically like that I would play a lot of video games. And I said, no, definitely not. But what she's playing Hogwarts Legacy. She's playing just got her Nino Cooney. Like she's playing Stardew Valley. Like she's selective. She's not playing FIFA with me. Like she's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
playing Fortnite or like Overwatch or something. Like she's playing the games that she wants to play. She's playing them the way she wants to play them, when she wants to play them. And it's like, I wish that that's the way that the video game culture was. I wish that's what that I was doing. That I wasn't getting swept up in the anger mobs and the like, oh, this sucks. Like, like, oh, well, we're not having, you can't choose between male and female. You just have a slider between, how feminine you want to look and how male you want to look, but you're not a male or a female. Like, it's
Yeah.
like just the nonsense that's at games. Like, I wish
Yeah.
I didn't care and I could just sit back and enjoy games, but it's not the way things played out.
Well, this has been a good conversation. We're well over an hour. We could talk about this stuff and all of its, incendiaries for a long time. But yeah, dude, I really enjoyed this, and we can pick this up again. It's a never evolving thing, right? Like what gaming culture is today is not what it's going to be tomorrow. Is not what it was yesterday, and so the conversation keeps revolving. But yeah, it's good to have you on and chat. We'll pick a more positive topic next time. We'll do something we like. You've had some good ideas. I really do want to do a show about like our favorite games, just growing up and talking like our seminal games, why we love them. And so we'll get to that eventually. But yeah, until next time, take us home, Daniel.
Play the games the way you want to play them.
We appreciate you guys listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.